Hello everybody. In this video I'll be covering the things that I wanted to say but didn't get to say in my videos about the sexual revolution, America being isolationist, and the video about Mexico. I'm gonna start off with my video about America becoming isolationist. I wanted to talk a bit about Yemen. You see, without the Iran-Saudi Cold War, thanks to Saddam kicking both countries' asses, I doubt the Houthi rebels would become a big issue of a thing at all due to no Saudis bombing or Iranian funding. You may think Saddam Hussein may want to invade it, however, now that Uncle Sam went home to reflect on things and figure out where to go from here, following the death of the Big Bear, the old Franco-British tag team would take it from here. With help from other NATO allies, Russia was in shambles. India is still timid and concerned with Pakistan, and China was still getting itself sorted out. Argentina just got bitch-slapped a few years ago, ensuring that Great Britain is still being taken very seriously on the world stage. Between the two of them, France has Africa covered, pretty much including Djibouti, and the British have got bases that are like everywhere. It's like the old interwar period is back. So even though the build-up would be too slow to stop Saddam from taking the parts of Saudi Arabia near to him, it won't be so slow that he'd be able to go after Yemen too. Yemen's political isolation puts it in a good place to be left alone. If it isn't left alone, there will be a, how do you say, desert storm in French? If you doubt this because Saddam sold oil for euros and France and Germany opposed the Iraq War, the Eurozone didn't exist in the 1990s. Not to mention both France and Germany supported the Persian Gulf War, and America going isolationist changes a lot from Europe. I can't say if the Eurozone will ever exist. The economies of the European countries would have to adapt to spending more on their defense without America covering theirs. Moving on to my video about Mexico, the smarter leaders of the First Mexican Republic would try to get northerners to move to Texas, but not many more would come than in our timeline except for the Appalachian Scots. Since the North is so anti-Catholic, but quite a few Appalachian Scots moved into northern Mexican Texas, so Mexico would make up for this by allowing single Southerners in who marry Mexicans. Alaskan Orthodox Christians, mostly mixed-race ones between Russians and indigenous people, since there were very few ethnic Russians in Alaska at the time, and even fewer indigenous people who were modernized by 19th century Russian or Mexican standards. And last but not least, Catholic Germans like Swabians, Austrians, and Bavarians. This latter group would probably end up being the largest ethnic group, since quite a few Germans moved to Mexican Texas in our timeline. These groups would keep the Anglo-Americans from overrunning them, possibly teaming up with the Native Americans to repel them, considering the Germans in Texas had a good relationship with the Comanche. But since Texas would still have a lower population, the Comanche raids would be more successful for a longer time. Not to mention they're fighting the Mexican army for a longer time and the American army for a shorter time. The Mexican army was far less formidable, so that's good news for the Comanche. Since their raids into Mexico would be far more successful, they would be getting more resources and there would be less Mexican raids going into Comanche lands. They would also do better fighting against the Apache. I think the Comanche raids doing better would create a domestic gun culture, since the civilians of Mexican Texas would need to use guns to defend their property. Not to mention the influence from the Americans would definitely help inspire this. Furthermore, because this timeline's Texas would have a high literacy rate due to the reasons I mentioned in my other video and the fact that Spain actively discouraged literacy in its colonies, and at least a small handful of farmers would have made it big, at least 2 or 3 universities would have started. It would have some very rich people who would start up industry. The demand would definitely be there since the civilians of Mexican Texas would want to have their guns repaired, transported, and upgraded as fast as possible, which would decrease the, up until this point, big difference between how successful the Comanche were in our timeline and how successful they were earlier in this timeline. Industry would quickly spread to the dry parts of Texas and nearby parts of Texas, since it will be more profitable than farming, which was the most common career back then. Not to mention many Seminole Indians, who are among the only 5 indigenous tribes that the whites considered civilized, had been invited to those dry areas to form a buffer against the Apache raiders. Had a gun culture and have a reputation for being successful and capitalistic. So I think they'll definitely industrialize those areas. This means even more doom for the Apache, since those they're raiding are better armed. There is another YouTuber who makes alternate history content that will have you believe that without a strong merchant class to oppose them, the political elites satisfied with the status quo can be as despotic or kleptocratic as they want, and that the Hispanic American countries didn't have a strong merchant class, except possibly Chile, Uruguay, and Costa Rica, which he considers first world, and that if Latin America had a strong merchant class, it would be wealthy. However, this is wrong. By the 1700s, the Viceroyalty of New Spain had a merchant class that was wealthier than Spain itself. So by this logic, the countries that used to make up the Viceroyalty of New Spain should be even more first world than Spain. Back to my timeline, when the Mexican-American War would eventually happen around 1850, and most of Texas gets conquered, many of the literate Native Americans would be deported to Mexico as a part of the ethnic cleansing, and literate mestizos would leave due to fear of being lynched. Then the American Mexicans would be persecuted by pro-slavery ones and start moving to free states, but the ones who only know Spanish follow their friends to Mexico. Then Mexico makes the offer, and a few who were going to move to free states move to Mexico to be with their friends, because Mexico would have realized that they need to industrialize in order to make sure they don't lose any more land full of gold or some other natural resource. Some of the Mexican elite would want industry started off by the Texans to be absorbed by a monopoly set up by foreigners, but a minority, which would be the remnants of the initial smarter elite that were in power due to my point of departure, may want to use what industry the Nortenos started and let them compete with each other, since they'd know nationalizing or monopolizing their work would cause them to rebel and make them lose even more territory to America. So the other elites would worry, and there would be a civil war. If all of them do want to monopolize the industry already started up, they would either have their companies forcefully absorbed by foreigners, or nationalize them to start up their own companies and use corruption or stupid laws to crush their opposition. Then the Nortenos would realize what they're trying to do and start a civil war. Any push into Norteno land is slowed due to attrition. Then the Nortenos push back due to much more production and better transportation, similar to the Eastern Front in World War I. But due to being a much smaller faction, can get overstretched quickly, but then tell the raiding Apache and Comanche they won't encroach on their land if they win the Civil War and receive their help. I can't say whether they would side with them or not for sure, but as usual, I'll go with a middle ground and say most of the Apache in Mexican territory would side with them, but most of the Comanche wouldn't. Since the Apache were more likely to honor their treaties historically, had a far less violent culture, would be under much more threat from an industrialized, hostile Mexico, while the Comanche, by this time, would almost entirely live within the US, would likely be in an even better position than in our timeline at this time. Not to mention the Mexicans would have been resisting the Apache much better, and the Apache would probably be at risk from the Comanche. But some Comanche war bands would definitely side with them, since they had a very good relationship with the Germans in Texas. And the reason why I say most is that neither of them have a central government, instead decentralized war bands. After the Apache and Nortenos traveled even further inland, they would have come across rebelling Yaqui, who were rebelling against being forced into a more contemporary way of life and being overtaxed. The Nortenos offer them freedom if they join their side. Whenever they conquer any territory, they offer mestizos, natives, and poor whites equality if they side with them. Eventually, they start to be overstretched until they meet the Maya rebelling during the Caste War and unite with them. Finally, the rest of Mexico is conquered. The reason why the areas with large northern European populations in Mexico will be the ones that industrialized first is north of Zacatecas. The environment, geography, climate, and society are so different from the rest of Mexico. The Sierra Madre Mountains, which push into the plains and fertile plateaus in the south, stretch into the dry Mexican north, known as the This region was too dry for large civilizations to form, for the Spanish to use to be as controlling as they were in central and southern Mexico, where they controlled most of the economy and all of the political power, who were satisfied with the status quo. The lack of craft workshops and proto-industry was caused by the ancestors of the Criollos' conquest of those parts of Mexico. A lot of precious metals came into their hands. It became cheaper to buy finished products from Europe and Anglo-America like clothes, thanks to easy silver and gold obtained by exploiting mestizos, natives, and poor criollos, than producing them in central or southern Mexico. This means Mexico would be far less corrupt in this timeline, since in our timeline during the Mexican Revolution, the various revolutionary factions started fighting against each other, since they had different solutions to the problems brought about by the Porfiriato. The PRI came out on top with no opposition and gradually became able to get away with almost anything. But since the Porfiriato wouldn't have existed in this timeline, that wouldn't have happened. All the goals of the different rebels are compatible except for the Norteños, who would probably want to broaden the state religion of Mexico from Catholicism to Apostolic Christianity, since a very large proportion of their population would believe in Eastern Christianity. But since they're the ones who started this whole revolution, they'd get that. However, Mexico's state revolution may be voted back to just being Catholicism later. Mexico would likely end up with Europeanish style political parties, socialistic party and a conservative one, because all of the poor are given the vote and most of the land south of where the Norteños live is owned by a few aristocrats. Socialism would be very popular, but this party isn't likely to be as socialistic as many of the European socialist parties are, since the Spanish Empire enforced a complex caste system, not only based on race but also class. A negative side effect of this is also the reason why I think Mexico's socialistic party isn't likely to be as socialistic as most European ones. It worsens social cohesion a lot. The majority of not only Mexicans but Latin Americans in general don't trust that people in their society are trying their best, that the rulers are cheating, and that if there's a class below them, that they're free riding. It's common for people not to trust their neighbors at all due to 100 years of different classes and races being coerced into having different and completely separate roles. Hence, much of the middle and maybe even lower middle class would probably object to something like paying slightly more taxes for free healthcare. Another thing is, I doubt Mexico would get free healthcare after its civil war like it did after the Mexican Revolution in our timeline. Since this timeline's Mexican Civil War would be before any country instituted free healthcare, and Mexico also wouldn't be accepting as many immigrants per capita as the United States. Depending on your point of view, the US is either more naive or less paranoid about immigration due to never having been military occupied by another country. Meanwhile, much of northern Mexico in this timeline would have been occupied by the US. By today, Mexico would be like a Christian, much larger and less overpopulated version of Malaysia, since Malaysia's former colonial empires had similar policies that bred distrust with Malaysia. But it industrialized a long time ago, and despite not remotely being a clean government country, is far less corrupt than Mexico is. After the war, my timeline continues much as it did in the other video, since even though there are still massive ramifications of Mexico allowing Americans to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy and the Church of the East's Nestorianism, which isn't the same as Orthodoxy, contrary to what many of you seem to think. Mexico recovers much earlier and faster from its civil war than the US due to it being more one-sided. They can unite the Catholics who still hate the converts to Eastern Christianity and those converts by directing their attention to a new common enemy, the US of A. Mexico is able to tip the scale of the American Civil War in favor of the CSA. For those of you who don't know about the Trail of Tears, many Native Americans in what is now the Eastern US before the Civil War were forced off their ancestral homelands and into Oklahoma. The majority of the ones in Oklahoma were from the those that Anglo-Americans labeled the 5 civilized tribes: Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and the Creek, aka the Muskogee. They were probably in the majority since they were seen as racially superior to the other Native Americans and were killed less often. Since the CSA wins the Civil War in this timeline, any rifts that may have been between these tribes that got extinguished last longer, since some sided with the Union and some sided with the CSA, and both sides survive in this timeline. Some of the Choctaw and Creek in our timeline fled to Kansas along with freedmen, but there were some Native Americans that also joined the Union Army in the North, and the North might insist on holding to at least the northern half. If all of Oklahoma goes to the Confederacy, then the Union-aligned Indians might be forced to relocate. The other 70 or more tribes who were forcefully relocated to Oklahoma, possibly because they were Confederate allies, don't wind up there in this timeline. In a timeline where the CSA didn't win the war due to the reasons they do in this timeline, some would move to Mexico instead, since Mexico used former Confederate allied Seminole, Kickapoo, and Shawnee, who fled from the US as a buffer against the Apache. But in this timeline, the Apache are mostly either defeated or allied to Mexico, or at the very least Mexico has been doing better fighting them off due to being more industrialized much earlier. I mean, I suppose some could move to be a buffer against the Comanches, but the Comanche would now live in an area mostly in the Confederacy. After the Civil War, the Confederacy would publicly thank the Indians for their service. But given how the South is suddenly cut off from Western expansion, they'd probably open the territory to settlement even earlier than happened in real life. Unfortunately, the South was just as ideologically committed to Western expansion, and they had just as much economic incentive to do it, and the space they had to expand would have been limited. The South might have a slightly harder time, but luckily for them, the native tribes post-War of 1812, which is before my point of departure, were never really a serious challenge to the US, and were defeated with a very little limited expenditure of resources. Surprisingly, on the other hand, the majority of First Nations might be better off than in our timeline, since the majority of natives forged an alliance with the CSA, and with their less centralized government, they would probably be left alone more often, at least as a state policy. However, a lot of American friction with natives originated from settlers not respecting native land and encroaching until they came to blows, at which point I highly doubt the CSA will take the native side over their own people. You see, plenty of colonists had forged alliances with Native Americans. Problem was, they went back to war as soon as they were inconvenient. They wouldn't honor their word, so I'd expect the CSA, or at least individual states in it, to stab any native allies in the back within 3 years. The CSA is not going to be investing in railroads to the west or the sort of industrial work necessary to really crush the Comanche. They will probably rely on heavily armed local militias, which will be enough to hold Comanche bands at bay, but not push into the Comancheria, so the Comanche would remain autonomous until Mexican and US reannexation. The US and Mexico would probably use the Comancheria as a sort of buffer state. In this scenario, they would probably last until the 1880s. For those of you who are curious, women's liberation would most likely still happen, just at a later time, because it began during the United States' time in World War II. First with huge changes in the demographics of labor between the genders, and then the introduction of antibiotics. We are fortunate to not have grown up with widespread syphilis, but it was more common then than genital herpes is now, and had much worse results and harmful treatments. Once people could be cured of syphilis, syphilis, and new cases stopped before they started so much more carefree. Fornicating was made possible, and now you could cheat on your spouse without the same risk of STDs. The pill had a similar impact 25 years later, but labor changes, women's suffrage, and penicillin are the big keys to women's liberation. But without the sexual revolution, women would likely be far happier. Women are inherently far more clingy after copulation than men are, due to biology, meaning hookup culture, a direct consequence of the sexual revolution, has given men power over women. Men would also likely be happier. In the Archives of Sexual Behavior, it says, sexual behavior may invoke risk for physical and mental health, seemingly proving the phrase, the less you scratch, the less it itches. Many people who believe they have a good or healthy sex life in reality are under continuous pressure from their cravings. They just have access to a partner or two who are routinely available to satisfy their cravings. Especially since under COVID, people, especially unwed men, are having less intercourse than ever before and are far less happy. But if they were used to celibacy, then they would likely be much happier. Not to mention, one of the biggest motivations for men to strive for greatness was copulating. Now that it is far easier to attain without a major commitment, there is less motivation. First, let's answer the question of when the first sexual revolution was. The one that was undone in the 60s and 70s. The one that made people sexually conservative. Many seem to think it was in the 4th century when Christianity became popular in the Roman Empire, Armenia, and Ethiopia. But a look at medieval Europe will show that that's not the case. In medieval Europe, friends and family would have sex in front of each other. Henry V did it with his French wife in front of his finance minister to prove that the treaty with France was fully consummated. Whole families and friend groups would sleep naked in the same bed. Women and girls would walk naked to their baths. The F word, or the word it's derived from, wasn't even seen as profane in medieval Europe. A word which means fornicate or copulate couldn't have been a swear word in a society where sex was pseudo-public. For those of you that are curious, neither was the S word. Defecation was also pseudo-public. People would fart and spit at the dinner table while eating with their hands, and torture and executions were even public events for the whole family. So when and what caused the conservative attitudes about sexual behavior and interpersonal relationship up until the 1950s? Some historians attribute the rise in sexual conservatism to epidemics of sexually transmitted diseases shortly before and during the beginning of the Victorian era. It was syphilis or one of those sexually transmitted diseases that was spreading like a wildfire. People would see others fornicate, then go crazy and die in an excruciating death, causing people to be even more sure in their God's existence and think that God was punishing them for fornicating, resulting in the extreme sexual conservatism at the time. To me, it seems like the HIV outbreak caused a modern version of this to happen in our timeline in Botswana, with it having the highest HIV rate in the world and being the only country in Africa with Christianity as its state religion, while all other countries in Africa either have no state religion or Islam as their state religion. I think other countries that had high HIV rates due to the outbreak, like Lesotho, would also become religious and Christian rather than secular states. Maybe not the Bantu South Africa if South Africa splits, since they would have been suffering under white supremacy for dozens of years, and the white supremacists who made them suffer called themselves Christians. Over in Nigeria, since the Muslim North was hardly affected by the HIV outbreak, they would likely tell the non-Muslim Nigerians that they were getting HIV for not being Muslims. For ethnic groups that never had a good relationship with the Hausa, the largest Muslim ethnic group in Nigeria, it would make them even more vigorously Christian, causing an even greater Christian versus Muslim dichotomy in Nigeria. Since Catholic and Protestant proselytizers in the south would have an edge, and the north aristocratic elite are the way they are due to the influence of the Sokoto Caliphate. For smaller ethnic groups that were largely polytheistic during the HIV pandemic, I think the Ogoni fall into that category, and their homeland has a lot of natural resources that the Hausa wouldn't want to share. If some of them convert to Islam, the other Ogoni Ogoni would outcast them. They wouldn't be treated nicer just for converting to Islam, because the Hausa would still be willing to destroy Ogoni land in order to extract oil from it. Since if the Ogoni teamed up with the Hausa so that they could both enjoy oil money, it would mean having to respect their land and health, which is expensive. I doubt the Hausa would even be willing to be nicer to the Ogoni to use them for help in keeping down other ethnic groups, since not only would it be expensive, but think about how companies generally haven't cared about who extract their oil or what damage it does to the farmland or people. Another ethnic group called the Baruba, however, probably would believe the Muslims that they were getting AIDS due to not being Muslims and would convert to Islam, considering their land wasn't being exploited as much as the other tribes were, since Baruba land isn't rich in natural resources and they were heavily impacted by the HIV pandemic. There was a period of prosperity for both North and South in the 80s when oil prices were high. Then the oil prices dropped around the same time the Cold War ended. There was a period of Nigerians overthrowing the government for sport, which resulted in southern Nigerians being treated better but not equal to the Hausa. In this timeline, since southerners have all their educated people, due northern Nigerians constantly giving each other the best jobs, will drag this period on longer due to immense Yoruba and Igbo nationalism and the fact that they both have all the natural resources, and thanks to the educated people in their territory, they can learn from their mistakes from the Biafra War, which was saying they would charge royalties on their natural resources while the Nigerian government wouldn't, causing the UK to take Nigeria's side. In this timeline, to rally support but not alienate the British, all they would have to do is not charge royalties to Britain, but that they charge royalties to other countries, and since these territories are full of educated people, at least one person would come up with the idea and two states would break off from Nigeria, a Biafra state for the Igbo and a Yoruba state, and Nigeria will be left with a massively weak, dirt poor and sad Hausa Fulani state. The Hausa state would become under French influence since France has military bases in basically all the countries surrounding the new Hausa state. They'd likely be invited in, so while likely Islamically conservative in some policies, thankfully a radical group like Boko Haram just wouldn't take power. If I had to guess how religious the Yoruba or Biafra states would be, I would guess the Yoruba one would be a Christian state and not a secular state, due to the dichotomy I spoke about and being more heavily impacted by HIV than the Biafra or Hausa states were. My final comments about these Nigerian states is that they would likely be less corrupt than Nigeria is now. First of all, Nigeria is a very low bar for corruption. Second of all, one of the biggest reasons why Nigeria has corruption in its DNA is that the northerners used it to hold back southerners. So with much more monoracial states, there'd be no need. The worst case scenario is that they'd have a similar corruption perception index to Togo, since Togo is the most corrupt country after Nigeria in West Africa. Moving on to the countries that will make up the East African Federation, since Christianity will be more popular both in and out of politics. Idi Amin, a Muslim convert Ugandan military officer who served as the third president of Uganda in the 1970s and de facto military dictator who assigned 17 or 18 of the top 22 military positions to other Muslims, is less likely to end up in power, and if he does, his reign of terror in Uganda will last for a shorter time. But the later conflicts between the Protestants, mostly Anglicans, and Catholics would probably last longer, not to mention being more prosperous due to AIDS killing more people and less brain drain due to the West accepting far fewer immigrants, will shorten Idi Amin's reign even further, because one of the things he used to stay in power was socialism to appeal to the poor. So with less poor people, then that means a shorter time for Idi Amin to be in power. Then again, since the Ugandans would hate Idi Amin so much more, maybe the Catholics and Protestants would unite against Muslims instead of being in conflict with each other, in which case we are likely to see many attacks against Muslims. If they still have the conflict against each other and it's pushed to the end, then the Catholics are more likely to win than in our timeline, since they outnumbered Protestants back then, and the Protestants won due to siding with the Muslims, who in this timeline, they and the Catholics would likely hate too much to team up with. If the Catholics win, that means Western Uganda, where most of the Protestants live, will be super oppressed. It was already bullied by Uganda's last two dictators in our timeline. The Catholics would also make Uganda a Catholic state, but this this may decrease the likelihood of the East African Federation forming or delay it, since the biggest player, Kenya, is majority Protestant. Not to mention, Kenya would be an even bigger player as it was one of the least affected by the HIV outbreak, so its population would go down the least, and up until very recently had the best economy out of these countries despite being the most brain drained, so it will have the biggest economy today in this timeline by an even greater margin than it is in our timeline. Another way this could prevent the formation of the East African Federation is that in the largest country by land area that wants to form the East African Federation, Tanzania, religion is seen as a personal matter. But this doesn't mean Uganda can't unite with any country. It can still unite with Rwanda and Burundi, which are majority Catholic. A reason why it is very likely that Uganda could fuse with Rwanda and Burundi in that scenario is the same reason why the following path it could take is the one where it is most likely to be a part of the greater East African Federation. This path is Uganda becoming a religious Catholic state with a lot of discrimination towards Protestants, but gradually becoming more tolerant to them, possibly becoming more secular as well. The reason why is because when the Bahororo people who descend from a Tutsi princess moved to Uganda after the Bantu expansion had already happened and made Uganda mostly Bantu, the Bahororo waged war against the people already in Uganda and enslaved them. To this day, some Bahororo people called non-Bahororo Bantus in Uganda Bairu, which means slave, because they saw themselves as Tutsis and not Bantu. They saw themselves as better than Bantus, and many in Uganda have been resisting the layers being built on to establish the East African Federation. Since 3 of the 5 countries that wanted, and I say wanted since South Sudan only became a country less than 11 years ago to form the East African community, are descendants of the same Tutsi royal family the Bahororo people are. Museveni, the president of Uganda, is Bahororo. Paul Kagame is obviously Tutsi. And the president of Burundi is also from a tribe related to the Tutsi lineage. So a lot of people in western Uganda see this as revanchism for a Tutsi kingdom or empire, since that's exactly what it looks like. And since the majority of Bahororo people are Protestant, they would have less power if they were being discriminated against for a long period of time, and it would have been highly unlikely for a Bahororo to be in power in Uganda, leaving only the 2 smallest countries that wanted to form the East African Federation ruled by descendants of that Tutsi royal family. I hope you guys found all that information about the African Illuminati interesting. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in a comment.